Friends, gather around. Let me take you on a journey back in time. Tonight, we're diving into a story of epic proportions, the Russian Revolution, a tale of struggle, power, and the quest for change. Picture Russia in the early 1900s, vast, mighty, and ruled by the one and only Tsar Nicholas II, a land where the sun never seemed to set on the grandeur of the empire. Think fancy palaces, opulent balls, and a whole lot of Fabergé eggs. The elite lived in a world of unimaginable luxury, where every whim was catered to and every desire fulfilled. But beneath the glittering surface, trouble was brewing. The common folk, the backbone of the nation, were struggling. Their lives were a stark contrast to the opulence of the nobility. Russia was a land of stark contrasts. On one side, you had the wealthy aristocrats living in splendor. On the other, the peasants and workers, toiling away in poverty. On one hand, you had the Tsar and his nobles living large and in charge. They were the epitome of privilege, enjoying the best that life had to offer. On the other hand, you had the peasants, the workers, the everyday folks struggling to make ends meet. Their lives were filled with hardship and uncertainty. These folks were tired of being treated like second-class citizens. They were wary of the endless toil and the lack of opportunities. They wanted a say in how their country was run. They yearned for a voice, for representation, for a chance to shape their own destinies. They yearned for a piece of that Russian pie. They wanted to share in the wealth and prosperity that seemed reserved only for the elite. The Tsar, bless his heart, wasn't exactly known for his progressive policies. He was a man of tradition, clinging to the old ways, resistant to change. He believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that he was chosen by God to rule. This belief made him inflexible, unable to see the need for reform. Not exactly a recipe for listening to the little guy, am I right? His detachment from the struggles of the common people only fueled their discontent. As the 20th century dawned, Russia was like a pressure cooker, simmering with discontent, just waiting for the right moment to blow. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the promise of change. And blow it did, my friends, blow it did. The Russian Revolution was a seismic event, shaking the very foundations of the empire. It was a time of upheaval, of chaos, but also of hope and possibility. The people rose up, demanding their rights, their freedom, and their place in the world. It was a moment that changed the course of history, forever altering the landscape of Russia and the world. Now let's talk about Bloody Sunday. It was January 1905, a chilly day even by Russian standards. The air was crisp and the streets of St. Petersburg were blanketed in a layer of snow. The city, usually bustling with activity, had an eerie calmness about it. A massive crowd of workers, numbering in the thousands, marched peacefully towards the Tsar's winter palace in St. Petersburg. They came from factories, workshops, and homes, united by a common cause. They carried icons, they sang hymns, they just wanted to present a petition to their dear leader, Nicky. The atmosphere was almost festive, with families joining the march, hoping for a better future. Their demands were simple and heartfelt. They asked for better working conditions, a little more bread on the table, the basics. They wanted shorter working hours, fair wages, and the right to form unions. What they got wasn't exactly a warm reception. As they approached the palace, they were met by a line of armed troops. The mood shifted from hopeful to tense in an instant. Tsar Nicholas II, feeling a tad insecure that day, wasn't in the mood for petitions or pleas. He saw the gathering as a threat to his authority, a challenge to his rule. Instead of tea and sympathy, he sent in the troops. The soldiers, following orders, formed a barricade and prepared for the worst. Shots rang out, blood stained the snow, and just like that, Bloody Sunday was etched into the history books. The peaceful protest turned into a scene of chaos and carnage. This wasn't just a massacre, it was a wake-up call. The streets, once filled with hope, were now filled with grief and anger. Families mourned their lost ones, and the air was thick with sorrow. Russians across the empire were outraged. News of the massacre spread like wildfire, igniting protests and strikes in cities and towns far and wide. The people had had enough. The Tsar, once seen as a semi-divine figure, was now viewed as a tyrant, a butcher. His image, once revered, was now reviled. The trust between the ruler and the ruled was shattered. This, my friends, was the spark that ignited the revolution of 1905. The events of Bloody Sunday set off a chain reaction, leading to widespread unrest and demands for change. The people of Russia had found their voice, and they were determined to be heard. Workers went on strike, students protested, and even the military showed signs of dissent. The revolution was not just a moment, it was a movement, a collective cry for justice and equality. Faced with mounting pressure, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to make concessions. He promised reforms, including the creation of a legislative assembly, the Duma. But for many, it was too little, too late. The events of 1905 were a turning point in Russian history. They exposed the deep-seated issues within the empire and set the stage for future upheavals. The spark had ignited a fire that would burn for years to come. And while the revolution of 1905 did not immediately topple the Tsar, it laid the groundwork for the eventual revolution of 1917. The seeds of change had been sown, and there was no turning back. The people of Russia had shown their resilience and their resolve. They had faced bullets and bloodshed, but they had also found solidarity and strength. The spark of 1905 was more than just a moment in time. It was the beginning of a new era. So, as we look back on Bloody Sunday, let us remember not just the tragedy, but the courage and determination of those who stood up for their rights. Their legacy lives on in the history of Russia, and in the hearts of those who continue to fight for justice and equality. The 1905 revolution shook the Tsarist regime to its core. Strikes paralyzed the country, factories ground to a halt, and the streets were filled with the clamor of discontent. Workers from various industries, united in their frustration, demanded better working conditions, fair wages, and an end to the autocratic rule that had oppressed them for so long. Mutinies erupted in the Navy. Sailors, who had long endured harsh conditions and brutal discipline, saw an opportunity to voice their grievances. The most famous of these was the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, where sailors took control of the ship and raised the red flag of revolution. Even the Tsar's own troops seemed a tad uncertain about which way to point their rifles. Soldiers, many of whom were peasants in uniform, found themselves torn between loyalty to the Tsar and sympathy for the protesters. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and the once formidable army began to waver. Nicky Boy, realizing that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated, decided it was time for a change. Tsar Nicholas II, often seen as out of touch with the realities of his empire, was forced to confront the growing unrest. His advisors urged him to make concessions, fearing that the monarchy itself was at risk. He issued the October Manifesto, promising some reforms like a fancy new parliament called the Duma. This was a significant step, as it marked the first time the Tsar had agreed to share power. The manifesto also promised civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and assembly, in an attempt to quell the revolutionary fervor. He figured, hey, a little democracy never hurt anyone, right? Wrong. The Duma, while a step towards representation, was limited in its powers. The Tsar retained the right to dissolve it at will, and many of the deputies were handpicked by the regime. This half-hearted attempt at reform did little to satisfy the people's demands. The problem was, folks were tired of empty promises. Years of oppression, poverty, and inequality had left deep scars. The people wanted real change, not just symbolic gestures. The streets remained filled with protesters, their voices growing louder and more insistent. The Tsar's idea of reform and the people's idea of change were about as far apart as Moscow and Hollywood. The ruling elite, insulated from the hardships of everyday life, failed to grasp the depth of the people's suffering. Their attempts at reform were seen as too little, too late. While the 1905 revolution didn't topple the Tsar, it did something far more significant. It awakened a sense of possibility among the masses. The idea that they could challenge the autocracy and demand their rights took root in the collective consciousness. It showed the Russian people that change was possible. The revolution, though ultimately unsuccessful in its immediate goals, demonstrated the power of collective action. It inspired a new generation of activists and revolutionaries who would continue the struggle in the years to come. It planted the seeds of revolution that would blossom a few years later. The events of 1905 were a prelude to the more dramatic upheavals that would follow. Leaders like Lenin and Trotsky, who would later play pivotal roles in the Bolshevik Revolution, were deeply influenced by the lessons of this period. You see, revolutions are rarely a sudden explosion. They are the result of long-standing grievances and simmering discontent. The 1905 revolution was a clear indication that the old order was crumbling and that a new era was on the horizon. They're more like a slow burn, simmering for years, even decades, before bursting into flames. The revolution of 1917, which would finally overthrow the Tsarist regime, was the culmination of these long-standing tensions. The aftershocks of 1905 were felt for years, shaping the course of Russian history and setting the stage for the dramatic changes that were yet to come. Section 4. World War I. The Tsar's last gamble. Fast forward a few years and boom, World War I explodes onto the scene. Tsar Nicholas, never one to miss a good old-fashioned European brawl, throws Russia into the fray. Now, I'm no military strategist, but even I can tell you this wasn't Russia's finest hour. The war was a disaster. Millions died, the economy tanked, and the Russian people were about as happy as a vegetarian at a sausage fest. The Tsar, bless his heart, wasn't exactly helping matters. He decided to personally lead the army, which, let's be honest, wasn't his strong suit. Meanwhile, back at the palace, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, was running the show. And who was whispering in her ear? None other than the infamous Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk himself. Section 5, February 1917, the Romanov dynasty crumbles. By 1917, Russia was a ticking time bomb. Food was scarce, the soldiers were deserting, and the people were fed up. In February, riots erupted in Petrograd, that's St. Petersburg with a temporary name change. Women, furious about bread shortages, led the charge. They weren't messing around, folks. These ladies had had enough. The Tsar, holed up in his palace, ordered the army to quell the unrest. But guess what? The soldiers, tired of war, tired of hunger, tired of everything, decided they'd rather join the revolution than fight it. Talk about awkward. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries, crumbled in a matter of days. The Tsar abdicated, and Russia was declared a republic. The February Revolution, as it came to be known, was a spontaneous eruption of anger and frustration. It was a chaotic, messy affair, but hey, revolutions rarely follow a script.